Today I want to talk about the 4 levels of ear training on piano. In this video we're going to cover what is the basic steps of ear training, what are the things that you cover when you begin ear training, all the way up to what are we working towards at a professional level, what are the things that we want to be able to hear in music that will make our piano playing that much easier. Let's dive right into it. At the first level, we're going to cover some basic things on the piano that are very important, that are going to lay the groundwork for the things that we want to do later on. Really what it comes down to is these are some basic theory components that we want to be able to identify, because it's going to help us with everything else we do. Now, at the very basis of it, I think there are 3 main components to basic level ear training. One is intervals. Now, when we talk about intervals on the piano, we're talking about them kind of in 2 ways, right? The distance between 2 notes that we play, but also the distance between 2 notes that we play together that might be part of a chord. These are things that we want to be able to hear. It's going to help us know if we're going to play a melody, those distances between notes are important for us to be able to hear, because that's how we're going to figure out what melodies even are. But then also, we want to get familiar with the sounds of these. These are what you might consider to be like parallel intervals, right? Where we play the notes together. And that's important because it's going to give us information about harmony as we grow. So the easiest way I like to think about intervals is just thinking about the major scale, right? Because we can always envision in our minds, you can hear that, right? So if you can go from there to there and be like, wait a second, fill in the gaps. Oh, well, that's just the 3rd note of the scale. So that's C, then that must mean we're skipping D, there's E, right? So this would be the interval of a 3rd, right? It's hearing the scale, hearing the gaps that we're creating. Now that sounds a little different because we know we're gonna go C. It's not that, it's not that, there it is, right? These basic interval steps, these are the things that we start out with when we are first learning about ear training on the piano. Now, when we start playing them together, there's almost a little bit of a different thing going on. We still can do the exact same thing. We still can pinpoint the notes. Even if they're being played together, we can still hear them separately almost, right? And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to just fill in the scale. However, there's an added component when we start playing the notes together, and that is some notes create a different type of rub to our ears, right? That, or that, there's a lot more of a rub there. That's much more dissonant than if we play, hear how smooth that is, right? Or also very smooth. So when we start identifying these intervals, we can actually start to learn, oh, wait a second, based on how dissonant that sounds or how smooth it sounds, it's going to give us some clues about what the intervals likely are. We can hear that it's pretty smooth, so we know it might be one of these, maybe a 4th or a 5th or a 6th. That's still pretty smooth as well, right? And then once we know that, we can then pinpoint the notes, hear each individual note, and then imagine our scale. And we can find that it's a 4th. The second part of the basic level of ear training involves identifying minor and major. Now, this is a very simple thing that we start out with when we're first talking about chords, so that's why it's included on the basic level. But it's a very important skill set that only gets more difficult as we move on. But when we first start out, of course, we're just going to look at triads and we're going to say, is this a major triad or a minor triad? And when we first start out with chords, we know that this happy, kind of positive, uplifting sound, bright, you might call it, that's major. And if we change it, we can hear a darker, more sad kind of sound, and that's associated with minor. Now, when we talk about chords, when we first learn about chords, we know that the only thing that differentiates minor from major is the quality of the 3rd. Here's what I mean. A major triad is built with the 1st, 3rd, and 5th degrees of the scale, right? If we do nothing, we're going to wind up with a major chord because we are playing the major scale. So that makes sense, right? That the chord that we use with the 1st, 3rd, and 5th degrees would be major, right? However, we only need to make one small change to make this minor, and that is we move our 3rd down by a half step, or we call it make it flat, or make it minor, because that is the only thing we have to do to convert a major chord to a minor chord. Now, when we are just talking about triads, this can be fairly easy. That's why it's a basic ear training skill, right? If you're playing along and you hear a chord, well, that sounds pretty bright, that sounds pretty major. That makes a lot of sense. What about, well, that still sounds pretty bright, pretty major, right? Except for when we change, ooh, that one's darker, right? That's clearly minor. Right, and if we go again and play, oh, now that's pretty minor as well, right? So we can hear the differences between major and minor chords. And it doesn't always involve finding that third in the chord and then answering the question, well, is that a regular major third or has it been made flat to be a minor third? Oh, I gotta pick that. No, we don't really do that. We just kind of hear the quality of the chord as being major or minor. Now you'll see as we move forward why that gets incredibly complex. And of course, the third part of the basic level of ear training is basic rhythms. Now when we first learn rhythms, we learn the differences between quarter notes and eighth notes and 16th notes and half notes and whole notes, all that stuff. And when we combine different ones, we get rhythm. It is very important that you are able to listen to a rhythm, listen to someone literally clap out, and then repeat that back, right? Now, rhythm, luckily, is perhaps one of the easiest parts of ear training because it's the thing that you don't actually need to really know any notes. You don't need to know any theory. All you need to do is be able to hear somebody do something rhythmically and spit it back. Now, it gets a little more complicated when we start tying notes and chords to that, but at the most basic level, it's about hearing a rhythm and being able to repeat it back. Level 2. When we move on to level 2, we start to introduce some more intermediate skills. Now, among these, we're going to start to talk about making more significant changes to those intervals that we covered in level 1, and now we're going to introduce things like melodic dictation, being able to hear a melody and sing it back. And then we're going to tie all that stuff together into some very basic chord progressions, right? So let's talk about what each of these mean. When it comes to altered intervals, the first thing that we need to remember is that any interval can be altered. It can be made slightly different by usually changing one of the notes. In this case, what if I took this F and I made it sharp? Well, now we have a different interval. This one's a little harder to hear. Now, well, maybe not this one in particular because a tritone, which is what this is, a pretty common interval, right? However, all of these different intervals, they can be a little deceiving. What is that? We are looking to start identifying when we take something like a regular major sixth and we make that sixth flat to turn this into a minor sixth, right? These are the intervals that we start coming across as we delve into more complex music. And they are the intervals that we're going to come across a lot when we start doing melodic dictation. Now, melodic dictation sounds like a complex term, and really all it means is the ability to hear a melody and sing it back, right? And that can be very basic. If I simply say, now that might change when I go, but at its basis, melodic dictation is simply the ability to hear a melody and repeat it back. And as we start combining things like alternate intervals, melodic dictation, as well as our basic level, we begin to equip ourselves to start hearing chord progressions. Now, these can be extremely basic, like something like, when we hear a chord progression like that, it's pretty easy to hear, but if I were to ask you to figure out what exact chords those are, what are the things that you're actually listening for that will help you understand what to play? The most basic answer is to say, well, that's simply the root of the chord, but that might be a little bit of an oversimplification. And it could make it difficult to understand, well, how do I hear that? How do I listen for one specific note? Sometimes there's a bass player in your favorite songs, and that can actually make it a little easier. But what you're really listening for is the home bass of all of these chords, right? If I play this chord, and I start asking you, well, what notes from this chord might sound like home? Is it that one? Not really. It doesn't sound like that one either. That one feels like home bass, right? And if we answer that question for each of these chords, right, if you were to sing, well, what does the home bass feel like? Is it that? Not really. Is it that? It doesn't really feel like. There we go. That feels like home, right? So that can help answer the question, what is that root that we're trying to find? Same thing here. Is it this note? Is it this note? Or is it that note? Right? It becomes clear the more you practice this. And then, same thing. Right? We can start to hear what note feels like home. So we are listening for the root of a chord that can help us identify basic chord progressions, but really what we're listening for is the home bass of that chord, because the bass player, or the lowest note on the piano, is not always going to be playing that root. So it's not always accurate to just listen for that root note. That's why it's important to understand how to identify the home bass of a chord, and it's simply the note that feels the most like home. This is something that becomes easier the more you practice it, but it does lead us to level 3. Level 3 is where things really start getting interesting and where this requires a lot of practice. Before, we talked about identifying major chords versus minor chords, right? But what happens when our chords become a little bit more complex than that? How on earth do we hear all that stuff, right? Well, we've started to familiarize ourselves with hearing things inside of chords. This is why intervals are so important, because even though I'm playing a C major 7 chord, what this really consists of is just intervals. That's it. This is a chord made of stacked thirds. There's a major third, this is a minor third, and that's a major third. And that's how we get a C major 7 chord, right? But the second we change that, now things start getting different, and we want to be able to hear, what did we change? What note changed? Did any of these change? Well, no. Huh, okay. That one definitely changed. We moved that from here to there, and that changes the functionality of the chord. Now, in the beginning, you might be listening for these subtle differences, but what you end up building the ability to hear is just the overall quality of a chord like that. And being like, oh, I hear this note, which, again, with our major scale, is the major 7th. So I'm hearing that, but then I'm also hearing that major 3rd. So I know it's a major chord. We've not made this chord minor in any way. We've not gone, right, and added something like that. That's a totally different chord. We kept the chord major and we added our major 7th. So you start to hear these things pretty instantly, and it can really help you answer that question right off the bat of like, what actually is going on here, right? And then we can do this with any variation of this chord. We've taken our 7th, we don't have that 7th if we sing our major scale. Those are very different, right? We moved that down by a half step, so we have a flat 7. And then we learn over time that that is, oh, well, that's a dominant chord. That's a C7 chord, right? Same thing, if we make the chord minor, we can start to hear that. We can hear the bass chord being minor, and then we can hear whatever we put on top of it. Oh, that's that major 7th again, only it's over a minor chord this time, which would create C minor, major 7, right? Or we have just a straight C minor 7 chord. It's a minor chord with a flatted or a minor 7th, right? So we begin to learn how to hear these shapes that are just beyond just your simple triads, right? This is an advanced level of ear training because it's hard at first to hear these things, but trust me, you will get more familiar with them and they will become much easier. But these are the important things that we need to cover. In addition, I would consider much more advanced rhythms on this level as well. These are when we start dealing with things like polyrhythms, rhythms over top of each other, tuplets, maybe even metric modulation or odd time signatures. All of those things we need to be able to hear. And it's essentially the same principle as before, it's just now we're dealing with much more complex rhythms. We want to be able to understand that if we have 4 here and we're trying to put 3 over top of it, we want to be able to hear that. We want to be able to hear the switch between those two things. Maybe we want to be able to listen to insanely complex rhythmic music and understand what's going on. The only way we can do that is by having a deep understanding of rhythms and being able to hear them quickly. Now, where that comes from is really just listening to that stuff constantly. I used to struggle with complex rhythms and time signatures, and then I spent like over a year listening to nothing but Tigran Hamasyan. And let me tell you, if you want a rhythmic education really fast, Yeah, that'll do it. In addition to complex rhythms and more advanced chords, we're now going to deal with more complete chord progressions. This is where we can start to hear things like jazz standards. Once we can identify more complex chords and more complex rhythms, we can begin to put together more of the pieces to complex chord progressions. Rather than just listening for the home base of a chord, we can listen for all of the elements of any chord, understanding that if I play, it's not just an F chord to a B flat chord to an E flat chord. No, we're instead hearing this is a full-blown F minor 7 chord, like a B flat 13 flat 9 chord to a E flat major 7 chord, right? We begin to hear more of these aspects of like what's actually going on in the chord progression, and it allows us to put together the pieces of an entire song that we might want to play. But in order to do that, we of course need to be able to hear those parts of the chords. We need to be able to hear more than just minor and major. We need to be able to hear what's going on if it's a 4-note chord, if there's a 7th involved, what's happening with that. And that's why this is on the advanced level of ear training on the piano. However, it goes one step further, and that brings us to level 4. At the pro level, things get really spicy because, yeah, my ear training course in college was a lot of fun. We would do things like just hold this chord out and, like, without looking at it, tell me all the notes in it, and then give this chord a name. What is this chord? Right? And you get these real crunchy things. And you just have to listen to it and pick out all the notes. Now, I think there are some interesting tricks to helping you do this, but your knowledge of intervals and then in more advanced intervals and altered intervals becomes absolutely paramount in being able to hear complex chords like this. Now, the trick that I learned, and this may not work for everybody, but I found that like I could in my head kind of like isolate individual notes. And I went over this in a video that I made on the main channel. So I'll plug in that thing that I'm talking about here. You can like arpeggiate the chord in your brain. Let me explain what I mean. Obviously, a chord just sounds like this, and an arpeggio would sound more like this. So this trick is a little bizarre, but check it out. We want to try to hear the arpeggio while we're just listening to the chord. Here's an exaggerated version of what that kind of sounds like. So you can see how each note, as we move up and down the arpeggio, becomes the focus. Now I want you to imagine that sound, but while you're just listening to the chord. Here's a visual to help illustrate what you want to try to get your ears to do. So that may not work for everybody, but it's what I found worked for me in being able to hear these crunchy, spicy voicings. But all that is more information to be able to tell us what's going on in a piece of music. In addition to being able to hear all the things that we've talked about so far in this video, we also want to be able to make assumptions about what's coming next, which means our familiarity with different types of chord progressions is going to become extremely important. In jazz, for example, we have like a 2-5-1. Now, a 2-5-1 is a sound that once you get into it, once you hear that first part of it, you can kind of go, oh, I bet I know what comes next. Maybe a resolution, right? Well, when we develop our ear and we become more familiar with more and more types of chord progressions, we can begin to make assumptions about entire sections of songs. And if we know basic things about the song to start, you can almost play a song you've never heard before with a group of musicians that you've never played with before, because you can make assumptions pretty accurately. Song form becomes particularly important when we're talking about this level. Knowing if a song has a binary form, if it has like an A section and then a B section, right? It's kind of the same thing repeated, but usually on the B, the second time through, something at the end is different, right? There's a lot of songs that are written like this. Another very common form that we find in jazz in particular is AABA. B often being referred to as the bridge. Knowing what these types of song forms are and being familiar with lots of different tunes that use them is incredibly helpful, because what does it do? Think about AABA. You literally just need to know A and B. And if you figure that out, you've got the rest of the tune down. Maybe there's a couple small things like a tag at the end that you want to be able to hear, but for the most part, if you know that something's AABA and you can quickly hear the A section because you know how to listen for chords, you know how to listen for chord progressions, and then you can quickly hear the bridge, you can put that tune together in maybe once or twice through the song, and by the time you're on the third chorus, you're playing along with everyone else like you've been playing the tune for years. It sounds complex, but I promise the more you work on ear training, the more you will get familiar with all of this stuff, and it becomes absolutely important. If you want to be a musician that can play with other musicians easily and quickly learn any song you want to play, these are the skills that you have to master. It takes lots of practice, but before you know it, you'll be hearing things that you never thought you could. And that's it. That's going to be all for today's video. I'm going to be building some really cool resources that I'm going to tell you about in the very near future, all about ear training more effectively. So stay tuned, hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. Thank you for watching this video, and we will see you next time.